Hi, Meenal.
Hi, Maansi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
great.
So, should we start?
Yes.
Great. So, whoever has joined, so this is a conversation that we are going to have on the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill. This is in collaboration with Vikalp Sangam and Maadhyam. Very quickly, my introduction. My name is Maansi. I'm the founder of Maadhyam. It's a civic engagement initiative. We follow Parliament and we bring updates from Parliament and policy making to enable critical citizen engagement. Meenal, I request you to quickly introduce yourself and then we'll get to the conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Maansi. My name is Meenal. I work in an organization called Kalpavriksh, and we've been looking at various laws and policies that look at conservation, including the FCA, and how it affects local communities, especially communities that are dependent on natural resources and natural spaces. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Meenal. I got a message that my voice might be slightly low. Can you hear me fine?
I can hear you okay. Can others hear her fine? If you guys can
It's
comment.
okay. I'll hold the mic closer to my mouth. That's okay.
Yeah, yeah,
So Meenal, so since this is a conversation on the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill, and this is a bill which was recently introduced in Lok Sabha,
yeah.
and immediately upon its introduction, it has been sent to a joint parliament committee for further study and review before it might be taken up by Parliament for discussion and debate. So since this is a bill which is amending the Forest Conservation Act, it's called the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill. So let's start this conversation by revisiting what the original Forest Conservation Act of 1980 is all about. So if you can give, for our viewers a very brief introduction into the Forest Conservation Act, what were the circumstances in which it came about, what its mandate has been, and whether there have been any issues in its implementation, any successes that can be attributed to the FCA. So yeah, if you could explain that, and then we'll further discuss the bill.
Sure, sure. This bill has been extremely fascinating for me as a law student because the birth of the bill itself is very interesting. So in 1976, we had the 42nd Amendment, 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, under which the forests were taken as a subject that both the center as well as the state will legislate upon. So forests became a subject in the uh, in the uh,
Concurrent list.
in the concurrent list. And subsequent to that, you have a secret note shared by the Ministry of Agriculture in 1976 with the cabinet that is talking about how states are destroying forests uh, due to a provision of the 1927 Indian Forest Act, which allows states to de-reserve reserve forests for whatever purposes that they can. Now, at that point of time, we had Indira Gandhi as our prime minister, and this note was incidentally sent by Manmohan Singh. And it really highlighted how states are using Section 27 to de-reserve forests. So before this, we did not have any act other than the Indian Forest Act to actually regulate how forests are being used for various purposes. So that's how the bill came about. It was an ordinance that was brought in, and in 1980, it became a bill. Now, the bill itself is very fascinating. It just has 5 sections. It has a very short preamble. So, if I can read the preamble, it says an act to provide for the conservation of forests and for matters connected therewith or ancillary or incidental thereto. And if you look at the provisions, it says that you cannot no state can by itself pass an order to de-reserve a forest land or use a forest land for what it says or non-forest purposes until the prior approval of the central government is not taken. And then it creates a forest advisory committee which sits at the center to look at all these proposals of forest diversion that will come from the states. And this committee will give recommendations as to whether this diversion can happen or not happen. So essentially, this was what the act was about. It just had 5 sections. The last sections dealt with penalties. The penalty was actually just 15 days of imprisonment. And that's it. And then you had the rules that came in. Subsequently, the Act itself has a very fascinating history of implementation because since it has just 5 sections, it was open to interpretation. There was no definition of forests anywhere. We still don't have a definition of forests. We go by the Indian Forest Act. And so the implementation of the Act itself was quite fascinating because you had the Act being implemented through various, you could say, notifications on the one hand, and then there was a lot of judicial activism that you get to see when you take the Forest Conservation Act. So you had this very important judgment called the Godavaram judgment, which is the continuing mandamus started by the Apex Court, where they are going on passing orders under this Act. It's still going on. And from this, there was, it gave birth to a lot of debates. What are forests? How do you define forests? So the very first order that was passed under the Godavaram case was actually saying that this act is applicable to all kinds of forests in the country, not just those given in the Indian Forest Act, because you also had state laws at that time that were defining various kinds of forest land. It also went on to say that it covers the dictionary definition of forest. So if you look at any dictionary definition, it actually talks about, the height of the trees and what a forest is, the ecosystem of the forest. So that is how the Apex Court defined the forest under this act. And essentially the scope of the act has expanded because of judicial pronouncements. So you have provisions like compensatory afforestation that were talked about, eventually giving rise to the CAMPA, which is the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management and Prioritizing Authority. And that was converted into the CAMPA Act quite recently. Then you had the constitution of the CEC, or the Central Empowered Committee, which is actually the friend of the court, the amicus curiae of the court when it comes to any matter with regards to, forest and forest conservation. And then, interestingly, post the Forest Rights Act came about in 2006, that also has opened up several debates with respect to the Forest Conservation Act and the provision of free prior informed consent of local communities who are dependent on forest land. So the impact of this act through judicial pronouncements and through the executive being pushed by the legislature to create lots of dilutions in the act is very fascinating. So this act, I think, is one of the most important acts that we have, and it's like a checklist provision to prevent a lot of our forests from being completely disrupted. So I think this act is really fascinating. This is like a short history of what the act was about.
Thanks for that, Meenal. So just like quickly recapping, so one of the things that you have identified is that this act came about in the wake of growing concerns that there was a lot of diversification or divergence of forest that was happening from forest areas for non-forest purposes. And so this act was brought in a way to check that, and one of the mechanisms that it provided for that was a way to seek permission before any kind of forest land could be diverged for non-forest purposes. And of course, you also mentioned the Supreme Court judgment, which also in a way enhanced what could be considered as forest. And I think that is very important because if I'm not wrong, every 2 years we have the state of forest report that comes out, and I know that every time the report comes out, there's a lot of politics that gets played around it in terms of whether it is accurately capturing what the actual state of forest in the country. The government almost every time congratulates itself on the fact that it shows that the forest cover is growing, but there is also a lot of concern, whether what is actually being counted as forest and all of that. So I think, it's interesting that you also mentioned the forest rights aspect of it and the rights of the communities which are dwelling in forest, and that is also an aspect that we will cover in this conversation. So moving on, so now we have this bill. But we also have, so, for those of you who might be interested in this, interested in understanding the parliamentary processes of lawmaking, before a bill comes to parliament, there is a policy called the pre-legislative consultation policy. It came out in 2014, and this is a policy which requires all government departments and ministries to do consultation on drafts of proposed legislations before they are actually converted into bills and introduced in parliament. The government doesn't usually follow this process. It follows this process only when it's convenient. In this case, as Meenal and I had discussed earlier, in this case, the government did bring out a consultation paper on what the changes that it was proposing to bring in the Forest Conservation Act. And I think, Meenal, while you talk about this consultation paper, what the consultation paper suggested, what your concerns were, etc. If you could also talk about some changes which were simultaneously happening through the forest conservation rules, because those rules were also amended at the same time. So if you could talk about these two things, and then we'll come to the bill.
Sure. So, like I said earlier, the bill, probably because it had just 5 sections, the Act, it needed a lot of notifications and a lot of clarifications, right, to really understand how it can be implemented. Now, but the Act itself has not been amended much, surprisingly. It was amended in 2010. The latest amendment was in 2010 to include the appellate jurisdiction for the Act, which was the NGT. So the appeals from this Act would go to the National Green Tribunal, and that was just the addition that was made in this Act. In the rules, however, we see that the latest rules came in 2022. But before that, we had the 2017 amendments to the rules. So the rules have been subsequently changed. And if you look at just what happened to the rules, so if I have to just talk about the Forest Rights Act, for instance, it's fascinating how the Forest Rights Act aspect was included in this bill. So somewhere in 2010, we had a very progressive forest conservation committee, right, at the FCA. And we had 3, there was an ecologist, I wouldn't take their names, but there was an ecologist, and there were 2 people who also looked at forest, problems of forest dwellers on this committee. And it was during that time that they realized that, this is going to, where is the FRA in this? Because this is affecting, if we have to talk about diversion of forest land in these areas, where is the voice of the local people coming in, right? And this was after a notification had been granted by the MOEF, which is the main authority under whose the act is implemented, had issued a circular in 2009 which said that you need to have free prior informed consent of gram sabhas that are getting affected by diversion of forest land. Now, mind you, under the FRA itself, we don't have any such provision. But here was a notification issued by the MOEF saying the consent, free prior written consent, and it was not just consultation, it was consent of local communities. Subsequently to that, this committee picked it up and said, we are not doing anything about this. How are we going to address this circular? So you see a change after their decision where they were asking for, Gram Sabha resolutions about the diversion of forest land and, looking at those provisions very seriously. That, of course, didn't stop the diversion of forest land, but at least the voices of local people were being heard and were being seen, and they were, put up in the minutes of the meeting. Now, in 2014, you have a very interesting thing that happened. The rules took in the provisions of the 2009 circular. Subsequently, in 2017, they were also very strict, sort of, you could say like a liability measure that was put in, because the person who was responsible for taking this consent was the district collector. He was identified, right? So you had a mechanism in which the district collector now becomes responsible to ensure that the provision is not only, followed in letter and spirit, but if something went wrong, or if it was found out that, the consent was not taken properly, the district collector could be held accountable. There was not a single instance where this provision was actually followed. You had one particular incident in Odisha where the people complained that their consent was not taken. This was in Joba. I think it was an SR or a Aditya Birla mine. And the people complained, and the MOEF sent a show cause notice to the local SDM to say that, how has this taken place? Apart from this, there hasn't been any sort of real, pulling up of officers who are responsible for this provision. So you could see that there are these kind of changes happening. At the same time, the act was also getting diluted through these changes. So, like I said, the act talks about prior informed consent of the prior approval of the central government for any diversion to take place, right, in states. Now, this provision has been subsequently and consistently diluted by excluding certain projects from the purview of the act itself, excluding certain areas from the purview of the act. So, two things. One is this a particular project will not be needing forest clearance, or a particular type of project won't be needing forest clearance. And the second was this particular area of forest land. So if you look at, say, plantations or, pre this date, pre-cutoff date. So these were all these provisions that were added. You can look at the handbook that is put up on the MOEF website, which gives a list of these, there are hundreds of notifications that have been passed under this act. So this is how the act has been consistently sort of eroded from what its original provision was. Now, if you look at the current amendments, there is a prehistory to that also. So, like I said, in 2010, the NGT was added as the appellate body in the act. Post that, I think what started happening is, if you look at the political situation in the country, and you also look at the international happenings, right? Around the time that the government changed, Um, and just before the government changed, actually, there was a lot of effort from several different state governments. There were letters written to the ministry saying, this act is really there are so many types of forest land where we just want to create opportunities for local people. We just want to allow people to do plantations, and this act does not provide that sort of a scope. So you really need to amend this act. And then you see the international sort of pressure around climate change and afforestation coming in, and that is how the narrative over the FCA also started changing. So if I remember correctly, in 2015 there was a circular again which spoke of how to integrate the private sector in afforestation. And one of the things that was stressed was that the Forest Conservation Act needs to be amended so that there is private public partnership included in creating afforestation or creating blocks of forest land that could be afforested, especially over what this guideline said was degraded forest land. And the degradation of forest land, apart from big infrastructure and all of those things, another thing that was listed was the use of forest for grazing and collection of firewood. So essentially, they were equating the loss of forest land from big infrastructure projects to local people collecting firewood or collecting or going and taking their animals out for grazing into these forests. So this is where the narrative sort of started changing, and that is how we've come to what the amendments we have today are. Now, we spoke about the 2022 rules as well. So those rules also are pretty interesting if you go into the details. Maybe we can look at it later on. But again, like we said, the consultation paper in October 2021. Now, the consultation paper itself was very, very interesting because it did not give any specific provisions. It didn't give a draft bill. It just said that it was a consultation paper. It was like, this is what we want to do with the Forest Act. So, if I have to very quickly go through some of the main objectives that were listed down for changing the Act, is the applicability of the FCA to private forests. And the main reason was that people are being scared to grow trees on their land because cutting those trees means that you have to take permission, and it's not going to be easy to do that. And it is a problem in several parts of say Uttarakhand, for instance, where people are not allowed to cut trees unless they ask for permission. Then the note also specifically said that the Ministry of Railways and Roadways, what happens is when land or forest land is allocated to these ministries, a lot of it is allocated in excess, right? So these excess lands over which the construction doesn't happen immediately but may happen in the future is also taken up. And those areas are declared as protected forests in some cases. Now, when they have to start building something on these lands, you have to go and take permission again from the central government. So they were not happy about it, and they said that taking all these provisions and all of these permissions from the central government is really difficult. Then strategic infrastructure across borders, because we had the standoff going on with China, and probably the government was also thinking of the Kashmir situation, and then drilling, surveying, investigation, those kind of processes. Those didn't. They said that you don't need to take these under the act. And also establishing zoos and safaris, which is exempted from non-forest use. So these were the kind of things that were spoken about in this consultation paper. We did write to the government saying that, this doesn't really, how are you going to change this? How are you going to get these provisions into the act? Yes, these are your, this is like a objective statement, the reasons why you're going to change why you need to change the bill. But a lot of this is based on unscientific observations. Where are you getting these, that private forests of people, you can't cut trees on this, or that is that is what essentially farmers want to do with their land. How many farmers in this country have land holdings that are that big to actually plant trees on their land and then ensure that they are cut and used for commercial purposes? No person, a lot of the farmers in the country don't have that kind of land. Infrastructure projects, yes, we do require some amount of land for these, for securing our borders. But how much is enough? And how many kilometers are you going to extend it? And these are also some of the most biodiverse regions in the country. Arunachal Pradesh, Jammu Kashmir, parts of Sikkim, parts of even Uttar Pradesh, where you have borders all across. So and for zoos and safaris, why is it so hard to take permission? If it is wrong and if it is destroying forests, it shouldn't be there. So these were the provisions that the consultation paper said, and there were two interesting provisions that could have been very used in a very proactive and important way. Was to keep some areas, they called it pristine forest areas, separate and not do any activities under it. Now this was, if you go back to the UPA government, this was the go no go area debate that had started at that point of time. So this was something that they had put into this consultation paper as well, which we thought was very interesting. However, it didn't say how those areas are going to be demarcated, who is going to be part of demarcating those areas, what happens to the national parks and sanctuaries, because you're diverting land from those areas left, right and center. So does it mean that you're going to prevent that from happening? So none of these was included. And they also talked about increasing the penalty from 15 days to a year, and for offences under the Act to be made cognizable and non-bailable. Now, on the one hand, if you're actually going to apply these provisions to user agencies like big mining industries or industries that have not taken consent and have started deforesting, then it makes sense. But what about a poor tribal who is trying to build a house and cuts down a tree on his land, that does not have FRA, does not have titles under FRA? What is going to happen to that person? So those things needed to be cleared out a little bit, which could have been done, which was not done. And then you had the amendment rules coming in last year. So the build-up to the Act has been that there is this increasing need to privatize more and more forest land, and then to create, you can say, create legislation around it so that it doesn't look illegal. So that is what is happening here.
Yeah. That's interesting you mentioned that, because I'm just looking at the bill right now. And it's what's very curious to see is that in its statement of objects and reasons, the bill specifically mentions that the aim and objective is to increase the forest or tree cover for creation of carbon sink, and to and they are also trying to change the name as it is mentioned in the
Yeah.
act from the English Forest Conservation Act to Hindi Van Sanrakshan and Samvardhan Adhiniyam. So it's interesting that that is what the objective is, and then what the bill actually provides is a long list of land which will not be considered as
Yes.
forest. So if it will not be considered as forest, or it will not be covered under the provisions of Forest Conservation Act, then if I am understanding it correctly, the requirement of applying for prior permission, etc., will not apply. And as you said, the categories which were mentioned in the consultation paper, the similar categories have been reproduced in this bill. So we see for instance, a forest land which is alongside a rail line or a railway, a public road. It talks about trees or plantations which are raised on private lands. It talks about forest within a distance of 100 kilometers along the international borders or line of control. So that's a huge area that they are trying to cover under this. And then any security related infrastructure, if there is forest around that has also been covered under it and has been exempted from the from applying for permission, etc. So since this is what the bill is talking about, while claiming as the objective is to increase the forest cover, which seems like quite an irony. So in light of this, if you could quickly, I mean, you have already spoken about how the changes which were simultaneously happening, the developments which were happening in the past couple of years, and where we stand right now. So and one of our audience has also asked a question on what the impact of this is going to be on the Himalayan region. So if you could, if you could talk about what the impact this bill could possibly have on the forests of the country, and if you could specifically talk about the Himalayan region, if you have specific knowledge about that as well. And then, because we also spoke about the forest dwelling communities, so what according to you would be the impact of the bill on the forest dwelling communities and their forest rights? So these two things, if you could quickly address. And then after this, I will have one more question, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type it out in the chat. So yeah, Meenal, please go ahead.
Sure. So so if you look at the amendments, I think we'll have to also look at some of the international happenings around forests, climate change, biodiversity issues that are happening, and to which India is a part of. And if you remember, the last time we had looked at how the Wildlife Protection Act has been amended, the Biodiversity Act is also going to come up now again. The amendments have already been introduced, and now you have this piece of legislation that is going to get amended. Before we go into that, I think so that is one of the overarching features that we need to consider here. We also need to consider that India has some very lofty targets that it has set for itself under the climate change agreements, right? It's talking about the nationally determined goals, and it's saying that this is the amount of forest land that we are going to bring under carbon markets. This is the amount of afforestation that we are going to do. So it's going to you look at that as the main sort of overarching umbrella under which certain we can say certain things, including the amendments to our legislations, are happening. Now, if I can look at what happened last year when the rules were amended, right? So it began there, where there were certain provisions that were added. First is, like I said, the Forest Rights Act was a provision that would ensure that if diversion of forest land is happening, any communities who are dependent on that land their consent is taken before even the thought for diversion of forest land takes place, the decision making. So, free prior informed consent was important for decision making for the central government to say whether the diversion of land can go ahead or no. What the rules have done is it's taken this provision away. It has said that after the central government gives consent, there are you could say, two approvals under this act that the central government has to give. It gives prior approval. It looks at all the documents that come in. It could also look at site inspection reports. It could also go and do site inspection itself. After that, it says that, okay, prima facie, this looks like it's not going to cause a lot of destruction, and that is why we will go ahead, but these are certain criteria that you need to fulfill. And so they issue a letter with, you could say, mitigation measures, or you could say, okay, these are the things that you would need to look at. Now, what it has said is that the FRA consent provision doesn't talk about the FRA consent provision at all. However, it talks about the provisions of the FRA need to be looked at post the central government gives the second approval. So second clearance under the act, which means that all that is left to do for the state government is to issue a letter saying that we are going ahead with the diversion. So what essentially happens is that the free prior informed consent has been completely removed under the 2022 amendment rules. The second, which again now I'm linking it to the commitments that India has made, is to create what they call land banks for compensatory afforestation. What this is preempting is that we are going to carry out a lot of diversion of forest land, for which we are going to need land to afforest, which is why we need to create these land banks that are going to be used as afforestation measures. We are going to show it on paper that this is afforestation being done for this forest land which is getting diverted. Now, you would have also heard that recently the diversion that is going to take place in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, the compensatory afforestation is actually going on in Haryana for this, right? Totally does not make any sense. But this has been legitimized and legalized under the rules, right? Where compensatory afforestation and land banks that are created can be used for any kind of afforestation wherever the diversion is happening. So you have this provision. Then a very, very interesting provision and a very dangerous provision that has come in is something called as the accredited compensatory afforestation scheme. Now, what this does is, essentially, this is India's way of entering the carbon markets, right? Where you have private players. So if I have, say, 10 hectares of land and I have grown any kind of tree on it, and it has reached a certain canopy, whether the tree is native or no, indigenous or no, what are the kind of benefits it is giving. Tomorrow, if any state government decides that, okay, we are diverting this land, okay, here is a piece of land this private person owns, we can get that land as afforestation for this diversion that is being done. So this is how, what is essentially going to happen because of this is, on paper, India will say, okay, this is the amount of afforestation we have done, while not reporting the actual amount of forests, good growth, old growth forests that it is going to cut. But it will be able to show that, okay, this is the afforestation that we've done. The afforestation that is done in certain areas is going to be tagged as a reserve forest, right? And the reserve forest, what our government has reported in an interesting, in an interesting report which I could share, it's saying that all the reserve forests in the country have been declared as protected forests. So what this means is that the target of 30% area under conservation, that also will get fulfilled. At the same time, you're also showing that we are fulfilling our carbon commitments by planting more trees. Actually, where these trees are being planted, nobody knows. So this is the kind of effect this is going to have. Another very dangerous provision that the rules added was that once protected areas, if there is a relocation of villages from that area, that land can also be brought under the accreditation scheme. So essentially what this is going to do is you see a lot of relocation from national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, as well as tiger reserves is stalled currently because the state governments are going on saying that we don't have money to relocate people. So essentially what this means is that Campa funds are now going to be used to relocate people from protected areas, and the relocation site is going to be used as afforestation and brought into the carbon market. So essentially what we are doing is that we are losing people's homes, one. We are also losing very good forests, and we are planting trees which are not going to essentially do anything to the climate change, to the actual climate change issues that we are facing, but it is going to get recorded in the carbon markets, right? And big companies and big players are going to be involved in this in the future. So this is what I see happening. Now, under the Act itself, the amendments that we see are it's included or it's excluded actually three kind of uh, you can say projects from approval or from clearance, requiring forest clearance. One, like you rightly said, is 100 square kilometers forest land in the line of control. Right now, like I said, all these provisions were actually already, they were not part of the Act itself or the rules itself, but they were notifications that were issued at various times. So we had, this was a decision taken in 2014, right? That and over the line of actual control, which is the China border, which is Arunachal Pradesh and those parts of India, where this was going to be applied. Now they are saying LOC and LAC, which means the entire Kashmir, Ladakh region, as well as the Arunachal region, as well as it could also happen in, in the border areas of Rajasthan and Gujarat, for that matter. So you're going to have 100 square kilometer area being completely exempted. The second, they are saying security related infrastructure up to 10 hectares. Now, where this will come up, that is not mentioned. Whether it is in the line, in the LAC or the LOC is not mentioned. So this could be anywhere in the country. Interestingly, in Chhattisgarh, in the Raughat area, local people have written letters against CRPF camps coming up in the area where you could say a railway line was going to be built to a mine, right? And that was passing through these several villages, and they wrote and to guard that railway line, because it is a left-wing affected area, they had put up CRPF camps. So essentially, what is going to happen in this case is that there could be security related infrastructure coming up in various forest areas over the country, and it's not defined what is security related infrastructure up to 10 hectares of land. The third category is defense related projects or camps for paramilitary forces or public utility projects as may be specified by central government, not exceeding 5 hectares in left-wing extremism affected areas. Again, this is the same thing. Now, this in 2013, this was done, right? There was a notification that exempted this project. Now, in that notification, they had identified 35 districts of left-wing affected areas where these kind of infrastructure projects could be taken on, because one of the reasons why there is left-wing extremism in these areas, according to the government, is that there is no basic facility available, right, for local villagers. So they had identified these 35 districts in that notification. What this act does, it says that the central government may notify left-wing affected districts. And in any of those districts, 5 hectares is exempted from, from any of these processes. So what you are seeing is that more and more land as well as more and more categories of projects are getting exempted. Um, there's also an interesting thing. The non-forest use under the current act includes breaking up or clearing of cultivation of tea, coffee, spices, rubber, palms, oil-bearing plants, horticulture, medicinal purposes, and any purpose other than reforestation. Right? This is what non-forest uses. So for cultivation, basically. And what it does not include is any work related to conservation, development and manage of forests and wildlife, including establishment of checkposts, fire lines, wireless communication, construction, fencing, bridges, culverts. This is inside areas which are important for biodiversity. So to protect biodiversity, you need water holes, you need trenches, you need boundary marks, you need pipelines. So these are the kind of things that that were included in that were exempted from non-forest use. Right now, in this act, what in the current legislation, in the bill, what they are saying is, apart from this, you also have silvicultural operations, which is again cutting down of forests. Silviculture is basically scientific forestry. So any kind of coop felling operations. What happens to the working plan under the IFA now is completely a mystery, because this was something that was essential when forest clearance would be given for these kind of activities. So silvicultural operations are gone. Establishment of zoos and safaris in forest areas. We all know what is happening in Corbett with the big forest rest houses coming up without any kind of permission from the MOEF. Roads are being built. So all of this is going to be done under the purview of wildlife protection. Ecotourism facilities owned by any authority or the government. So again, who owns this? These resorts and big infrastructure projects within protected areas could come up. So these are the kind of things that are happening now. Also, let's look at section 2. Currently states, no state government or any authority shall make an order without prior approval of the central government to take away reserve status of a reserve forest land or any forest land to be used for any non-forest activity or leased to any private person or authority, corporation, agency or organization which is not owned, managed or controlled by the government. Now think about the nationally determined goals. Think about the afforestation. Think about the accredited afforestation scheme, and look at what has happened here. The amendment is any forest land or any portion thereof may be assigned by way of lease or otherwise to any private person or any authority, corporation, agency or any other organization, subject to terms and conditions specified by the central government. So essentially you have all these categories now being exempted, and you are also adding subject to terms and conditions specified by the central government, which means that the central government can from time to time issue notifications and create more and more area to be exempted from the purview of this act. So they are preempting. It's almost like going to show what's going to happen. You're going to have more and more area completely being taken out under the purview of this act, which was not very effective in conserving, but at least it was a checklist. It was a piece of legislation that could be used as a tool to prevent large-scale infrastructure projects, which were very devastating in certain areas. And you have all of these things now being taken away. And essentially, we know what this is going to do to the local people, but what is it going to do to us in cities? Because here in Pune, we are demanding that an entire hill be declared as a forest area so that it cannot be taken over by the government for destructive activities. In Mumbai, you have the RA forest, which is not, nobody knows the status of that land. It was just declared as a reserve forest. But the government can now say that, oh, this is important for the security of Mumbai, and we are going to build a metro there because it's a security project. So not just local people in, not just Adivasis, not just pastoralists, of course they're going to be affected, but it also affects us, people living in the cities who have connections with important, forest-like spaces, which were bought under the purview of this act by the apex court. And now you have all of these provisions coming in, which are essentially going to, there's no, how are we even going to go to the courts, to approach the courts and say that this is happening? Where is the legislation that is protecting this from happening? So these are the kind of effects that this bill, that I foresee may happen in the future.
Okay. Thanks for that, Meenal. I think very comprehensively explained. So now, as we had mentioned in the beginning, the bill, it was introduced in Lok Sabha and it has been sent to a joint parliament committee for study. It's also interesting for those, who follow parliament, they might also be interested in knowing that, in parliament we have standing committees, and these standing committees comprise of MPs from different parties, and these standing committees are responsible for studying and reviewing and analyzing bills, and giving their recommendations to the government on the same. Now, with the current government, there have been concerns that they have not been sending bills to committee for study and review before they push them for passing in parliament itself. And this is a concern that was being raised time and time again. And so what this government has now started doing is, very interestingly, is that they do send bills to committees, but these are committees which are not the existing standing committees, but these are committees which are specifically formed for the purpose of analyzing that bill. So in this case also, we had a standing committee on environment, and that was a committee which was headed by an opposition MP, former environment forest minister Jairam Ramesh. And instead of sending this bill to that committee, which may have led to a more critical understanding and study of the bill has instead been sent to a joint parliament committee, and it is the government which chooses who are the MPs on that committee, and that committee will most likely be chaired by a BJP MP. So a lot of people have also expressed their concerns on the fact that whether this committee will be independent enough to give its a considered opinion on the bill to the government. But keeping that one point aside, now that it has been sent to a JPC, this gives you and other people who are concerned about the forests, about the forest dwelling communities, it gives them an opportunity to share their concerns with the JPC. So Meenal, very quickly, the last question from me and a quick response from you. What would be your recommendations to the JPC on, how can this bill be made better? And then we will take a couple of questions from the audiences. So very quickly, Meenal, your recommendations.
Yeah, so I don't think my recommendations or our recommendations as an organization will be accepted very. I mean, looking at, it's very clear where the direction is, right? The direction is, like I said, pointing towards carbon market trade. The direction is pointing towards utility of forests, which in itself is not bad, but how are we utilizing the forests, right? And there seems to be a complete negation of the worldview that forests are not just important as resources, but they are also important to maintain our life flows, our rivers. Somebody asked about the Himalayan region. The entire the entire area above the snow line right now is coming under the purview of the Indian Forest Act, which means that it gets the protection under Forest Conservation Act, and these are where our rivers are coming from. So I think the very strong recommendation that needs to go not just from civil society organizations but citizens in general is that you are talking about one's sarakshan or samvardhan, which means protection and conservation. Now, none of these two things are getting addressed here. This is the only piece of legislation that allows for a certain participatory decision making when it comes to what kind of forests can be diverted, what forests cannot be diverted. So I would suggest the government that those three, kind of projects that they have exempted uh, should not be exempted from the purview of the bill at all. The at the same time the the guidelines for compensatory afforestation and the scheme for accredited afforestation are needed. Please bring out those guidelines, get consultations, get public consultations on those guidelines, because India's public needs to know what is happening to its forests, right? It's important that as citizens we are aware of what any of our governments, the government, it is a constitutional duty of the government to protect our forests, and it is also our constitutional duty to protect our forests. So it's important that people really understand that these provisions are not going to benefit either the nation, where we are thinking that, oh, strategic defense needs to be done, or all of those things. You already have a mechanism for this. You don't need to completely remove these projects from the purview of the bill, because there are certain areas that cannot be touched. And that is from the security of our lives that we are talking about, not just, war situations or whatever it is. So I think these are the two or three things that the government really needs to do immediately. And we really hope that the parliamentary committee takes these views on board, because I can foresee that they have said that, oh, we already sent out the consultation paper, and it was very clear that we had written these things that were going to come in, but a lot of objections had gone in for the consultation paper as well. So I think those objections, as well as the ones that will go out now, need to be very seriously considered by the government. The third important thing that I would really urge the government is to look at the Forest Rights Act and its provisions. It has diluted its own amendments, the amendments that it brought out itself in 2017. So why did it do that? It was a good piece of rules that had come out. So it's interesting why the government has diluted it, and we would want the government to revert back to the 2017 rules, so that the forests are protected, and our ecological integrity is not completely given up in the name of progress or development.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Meenal. Someone has asked, can organizations send suggestions, objections to the parliamentary committee? We are hopeful that once the committee starts functioning, so it has just been formed. Once the committee starts functioning, it will invite comments. It usually does, and when that happens, we'll also share about it. So if you're following Vikalp Sangam, for instance, you will get that information. So at that point of time, you will be able to send your objections and suggestions to to the committee, some of which Meenal has already highlighted. And I think one point that you specifically mentioned is very, very important. It's not like under the current act, there was no possibility of giving permission for forest diversion to all these projects which have now been completely exempted. So all of that would have happened on a case by case basis. So you would have, the committee which you said, the empowered committee which was set up, it would have considered each project on its own merits and, given the permission. At max, I'm presuming it would have taken some time. And I think, with if I could just make a political statement here, I think with the current government, they just don't like taking time on things. According to them, development and all kind of progress can only happen if it's super fast. So anything. So even in parliament, debate and deliberation takes time. So let's just do away with it. So we have been seeing bills being passed within a minute or 2 minutes or five minutes without any discussion or debate, because who has the time to spend on that? So I think the politicization of time is very, very important to also consider here, and we just want things to happen very quickly. So all security projects and all development projects around rails and roads, etc., need to be completely exempted, because otherwise they will have to spend time applying for the permission and all of that. So thanks for that. I think I don't see any other questions here.
There are two questions. There is an interesting question on the critical wildlife habitat.
I was just coming to that. So I'll just read out that question. So that question is actually about the Forest Rights Act. And this question says that, just a second, I'm just trying to find it.
Can I read it?
You can go ahead and read it. Yeah.
Okay, under the Act, in areas where rights are settled, the government can declare critical wildlife habitats that cannot be diverted. Why have these areas not been identified? Okay, so yes, you're right. The critical wildlife habitat is a very important provision, and in fact, it is the only provision under the FRA which talks about free, prior, informed consent of local communities being taken to identify these areas. Now, as is with a lot of good provisions, most of it does not get implemented, and if ever it does get implemented, it is not done according to the letter and spirit of the Act. So in Maharashtra, actually, the process of declaration of critical wildlife habitats is underway. It's interesting because not all protected areas need to have critical wildlife habitats. There are very clear provisions under the Act that talk about how these areas need to be declared, which is through consultation with local communities, and if their rights need to be protected. Now, in Maharashtra, what has happened is a case was filed that precisely saying that these provisions are not being addressed. What is happening? So the court, the Bombay High Court, actually asked the state government, issued a show cause notice to the state government saying what has happened. So the state government very hurriedly sent a list of all the protected areas in Maharashtra, saying that we will declare critical wildlife habitats on all these areas. Now, it's important to understand that the declaration of these areas has not happened with the rights of local people being taken into consideration. If we say that, the Wildlife Protection Act does not allow for it, it does allow for it. There is an entire chapter on how protected areas need to be declared, but that has never been followed. What has subsequently happened in the critical wildlife habitat case in Maharashtra is that the government has now sent 10 protected areas over which critical wildlife habitats can be declared, saying that there is no presence of local communities in these areas. Now, that is not true. We have done a survey of, my colleague Akshay is listening in on this. So he has done a little bit of survey on understanding whether villages exist in these areas or no. They definitely exist. Apart from this, there are also people like pastoralists, nomadic communities, single women households that are dependent on these forests. So dependency and occupancy cannot be, they cannot be diverted from each other. These have to be looked at together. And there are organizations that have joined this case and are bringing up these bringing up these issues before the Bombay High Court. So it's interesting what is happening with regards to critical wildlife habitats. But you are absolutely right. These areas cannot be diverted once they have been identified. But the way it's been implemented is not really good. I think there was one more question on whether the definition of forest has been addressed. So no, the definition of forest actually under this bill has not been addressed at all. What the government is trying to do is, or what the bill is trying to do is actually to exempt certain projects, like we already discussed under this act. There has been no effort to define forests, and I think that is going to be a very difficult task. If we just look at the forest estate in the country and how it was created, I think that's going to be a slightly difficult task. And frankly, I don't see the need for defining a forest, right? Because I think whatever legislations that we have right now, we have to also understand that these are legislations that are somewhat giving legitimacy to forest dwellers, because you have receipts under certain acts that they have collected over the years, which can be used as evidences to get land, to get their ancestral land back. Now, if you start defining forests, then it's going to be really difficult for us to actually get into the details of what forest means. There are different forests in different states in India. So I personally feel that it's going to be a very difficult task to define forests. And in fact, there have been committees set up at various points of time trying to define forests, and they've failed. Even with the current government also, there was a committee that was set up probably in 2017 or 18, or before that, I think. And they realized that that's a thing that you can't get into. So it's easier to just keep diluting the laws as and when they can. So yeah.
Thanks, Meenal, for that. And I think another political statement that I can make there is that if you leave something undefined, then it's easier to manipulate the same. So
true, both ways.
Both ways, absolutely, both ways. So that's why I was wondering when you were saying that it's difficult to define forest, and I was wondering then how do they go about enumerating in those biannual reports that we get on status of forest reports. What are the forests that are calculated under that? So anyway, I think conversations for future on how these can be addressed. But thank you so much for all who joined. I hope you found this conversation useful. So as we had mentioned that this bill has recently been introduced into a committee. This conversation that we just had was an effort to start a conversation on this topic, as the committee will also start its process of deliberating on the bill. Any of you who are interested, who of course joined this conversation live, will also be able to, the recording of this will also be available on our channels on Instagram. We will also make it available on YouTube for further circulation. So you can, use the points that have been discussed in this conversation to study the bill, analyze the bill, and to send your comments and suggestions to the committee as it deliberates on the bill. And whenever in the future the bill comes up for discussion and debate in Parliament, at that time also this might be useful for any engagement or advocacy that you might want to undertake with MPs. So thank you so much once again. Thank you, Meenal, for joining this conversation. And I think very comprehensive, discussion that we had today. And I know it's not easy to wrap all of this up in just 1 hour. There was a lot to unpack, all the different threads that you tried to join together of, how everything is coming together to, and it's important to identify all of that as well.
Yes.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vikalp Sangam, for making this possible. And then finally, good night, everyone.
Bye, Maansi. Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.